Hello and welcome to the second episode of Rambling About 007. Now, today we're going to be talking about From Russia with Love. From Russia with Love is definitely one of the absolutely best Bond films, and that's just a fact, really. I think what's interesting about From Russia with Love is it takes what Dr. No established, and like any good sequel, it just builds upon it. I think that Sean Connery is absolutely fantastic in his second entry as 007. I think From Russia with Love is very good as like a classic Cold War 60s spy adventure. There's a lot of meaty dialogue in this one. I think it's not really a Bond film to show to people like who haven't really been into Bond, who are trying to get into Bond. This isn't that, because I think they'd be put off by the long scenes of just chatting, or not really chatting, it's probably a bit more serious than just a casual nit-nat. But anyway, it's a very, very good film. One aspect of From Russia with Love that I think that often gets overlooked is the production design. Ken Adams' production design was very good in Dr. No, under a modest budget of only £1 million. But in From Russia with Love, it just has that class. It has that added layer of Bondian quality. Again, this is probably the first Bond series film where it feels like Bond. It feels recognisably like a Bond film. I think Dr. No, it's a bit weird because it is a Bond film, but it also kind of isn't. It's got this weird music in it, but especially the music. From Russia with Love's identity from a musical standpoint is much more part of what we recognise later on as the Bond identity, and that plays into why I think people like From Russia with Love so much. Red Grant is an absolutely stellar villain, frankly. Just such a great presence. Robert Shaw did such a fantastic job as Red Grant. The cast in general for From Russia with Love is very good. Blofeld's brief appearances are great. The ones he has scattered throughout this film are really, really good. I think the thing about From Russia with Love is when people are asked what's the best Connery film, there'll be two, potentially three films. They'll either say From Russia with Love, or they'll say Goldfinger, or, less likely, Thunderball. And I think that From Russia with Love and Goldfinger are in a tussle, because From Russia with Love is classic Bond, but it's still quite down to earth, whilst Goldfinger's the one where we all know that is really where the classic Bond formula really got into its stride. The formula was established from that point onwards. And I think that Dr. No was good, but it is a bit muddled. This one's a much more laser-focused Bond film. And Connery is seriously good in this. I mean, he was very good in Dr. No, but in this he has really much better screen presence. It's interesting, actually, because From Russia with Love isn't much longer than Dr. No. It's, it's only 5-6 minutes longer, and it feels a lot longer, not in a sense that it's boring, but in the sense it has much more plot. There's a lot more going on to talk about. So that's something to focus on. And I'm going to butcher this name, but Daniela Bellecci as Tatiana Romanova obviously is one of the most well-known and liked Bond girls in the entire series. I think that Honey Rider, as great as Honey Rider is visually from that iconic scene of her coming out of the water, there isn't really a lot to talk about with the character, whilst Romanova has a lot more going for her and has good chemistry with Connery. Lottie Lenya as Rosa Klebb is probably one of the best villains in the entire series. Really chilling at times screen presence. And, the cast is brilliant. The entire sequence on the train is really, really good. It's hard to really find anything in From Russia with Love that is really bad, or at least aggressively bad. I mean, I know it gets some unfavourable comparisons to what is it? North by Northwest, the Alfred Hitchcock film. But that's quite a geeky criticism. I think most people would never think, oh, it's a bit too much like North by Northwest. I think people would just be able to look at it as entertaining 1960s spy flick, or film. I think calling it a flick is diminishing what it is, actually. So, what do you think of From Russia with Love? What is it about this film that has sort of reverberated and echoed down the generations? Because it is a film that is almost 60 and is 59 this year, and that's pretty old. There's very few people left alive who made the film, and yet somehow this film has really stayed with people. I think I read somewhere that From Russia with Love is the favourite Bond film of Daniel Craig, Sean Connery, and Pierce Brosnan. I could be wrong, but I believe there are 3 Bond actors who said that From Russia with Love was their favourite. So that, I think, speaks to the volume of appreciation that this film has, not just amongst Bond fans, because Bond fans like all sorts of oddball entries like A View to a Kill. That film has its fans, but From Russia with Love is a film that has widespread acclaim still, many decades later. I think one thing From Russia with Love absolutely gets bang on right, like Dr. No, and like Goldfinger, in fact, is a simplicity. From Russia with Love is actually a very simple film, I find at least, to follow. This isn't something that the Bond films have always been able to do, able to be an easy to follow plot. Thunderball, I think, is guilty of being a bit boring, to be honest, and I think it's boring because it's just sort of needlessly complicated. But we'll get to Thunderball when we get to Thunderball. For my money, Thunderball is, however, the last Bond film for some time that is really quite grounded. I think once you get to Goldfinger, there's this campy and more silly quality. I wouldn't say Goldfinger is like terrible. I really like Goldfinger. Obviously, you couldn't be a Bond fan and not like Goldfinger, at least to some degree. It's definitely top 10 at least. But it is where there is a noticeable shift in the style. If you've been paying attention, I don't know how many people were analysing these films back in the early 60s, but yeah. And obviously, From Russia with Love works very well as an adaptation to the original novel. The original novel by Ian Fleming is very, very good, but this is a good adaptation. You know, it doesn't really jettison much from the original novel. It has a lot to... I think it's a story that works visually. I mean, not every Bond novel was adapted perfectly, for a multitude of reasons, but I suspect because some of them just wouldn't have translated very well onto the big screen, whilst From Russia with Love clearly did adapt very, very well. So these are my musings on From Russia with Love. But again, what do you think of From Russia with Love? Thank you for listening, of course, and I'll be back at some stage to talk about Goldfinger.